Wait for it. There we go. All right, class, let's get started on our next discussion on the endocrine system. So we just finished our discussion on how the endocrine system can be compared and contrasted to the nervous system. In this discussion, we're going to focus primarily on the hypothalamus. So as we look at the hypothalamus, hypo meaning below. What's it below? It's below the thalamus. So in our brain, we have the hypothalamus right here, which is directly beneath or inferior to the thalamus. As we look at the hypothalamus, it forms the floor and walls of the third ventricle of the brain. So here is a mid-sagittal slice showing our hypothalamus. Here we can have a coronal or frontal slice showing our hypothalamus, and then we can see how there's these different colored areas within the hypothalamus. Those different colored areas are going to perform different functions from the hypothalamus, and then to have a more complete view, we can see how there's many regions within the hypothalamus. Each of these separate regions within the hypothalamus are going to be associated with a separate function. Please don't bother memorizing all these. There's really, really tiny fonts. If you take a neuroanatomy class or an endocrinology class, you'll focus on those regions in more detail. I want to emphasize that the hypothalamus focuses on primitive functions. When I say primitive functions, I mean functions that we must have to stay alive. Things like fluid or water balance in our bodies, body temperature, or sex drive, and it helps to regulate childbirth as well. No hypothalamus means no human beings, means no human species. And most people are going to not live a long time at all, will pass away in a very short period of time if they have a malfunctioning hypothalamus. As we're looking at the hypothalamus, it's going to make decisions and send those decisions to that pituitary gland directly beneath it. So discussion on the hypothalamus really is tough to have without talking about the pituitary gland to some degree. As we look at the pituitary gland, it's going to be directly inferior to the hypothalamus. It's going to be connected by a stalk. Sometimes that stalk is called the infundibulum. And as we look at the pituitary gland, it's kind of a two-in-one. It's going to have an anterior and a posterior lobe. The location of the pituitary gland is within the sphenoid bone, particularly the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. And some people think it looks like a kidney bean. I, in particular, think it looks, at least in the diagrams, looks like a scrotum. If you do a brain dissection and look at an actual brain, it really looks more like a kidney bean than a scrotum. This figure is overemphasizing cleavage furrow between the anterior and posterior pituitary glands. So as we're looking at the pituitary gland, hypophysis and the neurohypophysis. I know, that's a tongue twister for me right there. Also known as the anterior and posterior pituitary glands have different functions. They're distinctly different from each other. As we look at the technical names of these anterior and posterior pituitary glands, the technical names do a great job of indicating how they interact with the hypothalamus or how they're controlled. The neurohypophysis is going to have neurons traveling directly to it from the hypothalamus, and hormones traveling directly from the neuroendocrine cells of the hypothalamus, whereas the adenohypophysis or anterior pituitary gland is going to be primarily controlled by hormones of the bloodstream, many of which are going to be associated with the adrenal glands. So as we look at adenohypophysis, anterior pituitary gland, it's the big one. It makes up the vast majority of the pituitary gland. It's also going to have darker tissue coloration to it. So when you're in lab and you're trying to distinguish on the slide, is this an anterior or this is a posterior pituitary gland? Look at the coloration. Anterior pituitary gland is more pigmented than the posterior pituitary gland. To get the anterior pituitary linked to the posterior pituitary, we have the hypophyseal portal system. This hypophyseal portal system is going to be a capillary bed in the adrenal gland connected to a capillary bed, not adrenal, I mean hypothalamus. A capillary bed in the hypothalamus connected to a capillary bed in the anterior pituitary gland. And what ends up happening is that hypothalamic hormones from the hypothalamus, are going to travel from this capillary bed down to the adrenal gland, and then within the adrenal gland, those hormones are going to cause their associated functions and cause the anterior down into the pituitary gland. And then down in the pituitary gland, those hormones are going to cause the anterior pituitary to release new hormones in response. Up next, we have the posterior pituitary gland, the neurohypophysis. And as we look at this neurohypophysis, it's going to be controlled by the hypothalamus. Within the hypothalamus, we have some nerve tissue, some neurons that are going to create hormones, and those hormones travel down the axons of the neuron and then be released and stored in the posterior pituitary gland. So really to emphasize the distinct difference between the posterior and the anterior pituitary gland is the anterior pituitary gland makes its own hormones and releases them directly into the bloodstream, whereas the posterior pituitary gland is going to store hormones made in the hypothalamus and then release those hormones into the bloodstream. The two hormones that we like to focus on are oxytocin and ADH, antidiuretic hormone. They're made in the hypothalamus, stored in the posterior pituitary, and then when needed, released into the bloodstream from the posterior pituitary. So as we look at the hypothalamus, there are 8 hormones in the hypothalamus we like to focus on. 6 of them are going to focus on regulating the posterior pituitary, and then 2 will be released into the capillaries. 6 will focus on the anterior pituitary, and then 2 are going to focus on the posterior pituitary. The 6 releasing and inhibiting hormones that are going to be going to the anterior pituitary are fairly straightforward. We have thyroid releasing hormone, we have corticotropic releasing hormone, gonadotropic releasing hormone, and growth hormone releasing hormone. As we look at these hormones that travel from the anterior pituitary, or that are going to travel to the anterior pituitary gland, they are going to cause the anterior pituitary gland to release thyroid stimulating hormone, prolactin, adrenocorticotropic, or excuse me, ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and growth hormone. These hormones in particular, let me clear the screen right here for you. I want you to pay special attention to the hormones that are released from the anterior pituitary gland. And I just want to emphasize this can be kind of overwhelming for students. To help this make more sense to you, I have a worksheet. One of my supplemental participation worksheets is focusing just on the hormones of the body, naming the hormone, the gland the hormone comes from, and the function of the hormone. So log into Canvas, check out that worksheet. It's a great supplement to this lecture. Now, as we're looking at, let me clear this window out for us right here. As we are looking at the PIH, posterior pituitary prolactin inhibiting hormone. Prolactin inhibiting hormone inhibits the secretion of prolactin and somatostatin. These are going to be hormones that are associated with producing breast milk, or excuse me, prolactin inhibiting hormone is going to inhibit the secretion of prolactin. Another one is somatostatin. Somatostatin inhibits the release of growth hormone and thyroid stimulating hormone made by the anterior pituitary gland. Now, as we're looking at the hypothalamic hormones, the 2 that I mentioned before that we really want to focus on are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. They're going to be produced in the hypothalamus and then stored and released by the posterior pituitary gland. Within the hypothalamus, it's the paraventricular nuclei that produces the oxytocin and the supraoptic nuclei, which produces the antidiuretic hormone. And I need to emphasize this again and again and again. The posterior pituitary gland does not synthesize these hormones. It stores and releases these hormones. That's all we have for this recording. If you have any questions, please feel free to post them on the class discussion board or to shoot me an email. And as always, happy studies.